The Madness of the Masked Man. Susan had a terrifying experience a few years ago. It all began on a Tuesday night. Susan was enjoying a rare evening alone when her husband, Jeff, called to let her know he was stuck in traffic and would stay at a motel overnight. He promised to call her when he got home. Susan sighed and returned to her book. She wasn't afraid of being alone at night as she was used to it, but as time passed, she began feeling increasingly bored and restless. She had completed all the chores and errands, leaving her with nothing else to do but sit in the room. Susan decided to take a long, hot bath to relax that evening. The past few weeks had been stressful, and she looked forward to a moment of peace and quiet to wash away the tension. Suddenly, there was a faint knocking sound from downstairs. It was weak, like a distant noise. She frowned, uncertain. Maybe it was nothing, but the uncertainty gnawed at her. She stepped out of the bathroom and descended the stairs, feeling the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The living room appeared calm, but something felt off. Then she felt a draft. The cold night air blew in through the window. Susan froze, hurrying to close it, but before she could, a shadow appeared on the other side. A man wearing a mask and a black hoodie stared directly at her, his hands on his hips as if daring her to approach.
Come outside, Susan.
Panicking, she slammed the window shut, locked it tightly, and ran to escape. Seconds later, the sound of shattering glass echoed through the house. He had broken the window to get inside. The man, wielding a knife, stepped through the window, his mask still on, and hoodie pulled tight. His movements were slow and deliberate, like a predator toying with its prey. Susan frantically locked the living room door and rushed upstairs to the second floor. He was right behind her, chasing leisurely.
Don't run like that, girl. I'll catch you soon enough.
Susan stumbled through the hallway, entering the master bedroom. Her breathing was shallow, as she strained to hear any sound from downstairs. Susan stepped into a small, rarely used room on the second floor. But one thing she was certain of, he wouldn't find it. It was a hidden space in the attic, known only to her and her husband. She was sure no one from the outside would see her as Susan pressed herself against the wall. A voice echoed just outside the attic door.
Oh, Susan. I know you're here.
A voice strangely familiar. Susan could hear his creaking footsteps getting closer. A terrifying silence filled the air. In a flash, he appeared right in front of her. The mask had now slipped slightly. Her body turned cold as she suddenly recognized the familiar eyes staring back at her. Susan whispered,
"Jeff?"
She backed away in fear. The man smiled, gripping the knife tightly.
Don't worry, Susan. I'm doing this for us.
Perhaps from excitement, the mask slid partially off his face, and what she saw made the realization even more horrifying. It was Susan's husband, standing right in front of her. His knife rose as he laughed.
"What are you doing, Jeff? What's wrong with you?"
He only laughed louder and stepped forward, shoving Susan against the wall. His eyes were something she had never seen before, the eyes of a true madman. At that moment, she knew Jeff had completely lost control.
Don't worry, Susan. I'm doing this for us,
he said, pulling a syringe out of his pocket while holding the knife in his other hand. He gripped Susan's hand and held the syringe, slowly and mockingly bringing it toward her neck.
It'll be gentle, my love.
Susan screamed in terror and kicked him in the shin, causing him to stumble and shatter the syringe. She fled from the attic, but he quickly chased after her, shouting angrily. As he raised the knife above her, a loud noise erupted. Susan turned to see he had tripped down the stairs. Susan didn't stop running until she reached the neighbor's house and called the police. Her husband, Jeff, was finally apprehended and committed to a psychiatric hospital. Doctors diagnosed him with severe delusions and paranoia, which had driven him to aggression and irrationality. Since then, Susan has been almost constantly afraid of being alone at night. Her fear is so overwhelming that she now suffers from agoraphobia and panic attacks whenever she's alone at home. At times, she needs medication to calm herself. Nightmare ski trip. Lily's first big skiing trip. She and her friend rented a cabin in Snowmass, right next to the Aspen Mountain Ski Resort. It was her first time snowboarding, and although she had faced a few challenges on the slopes, she was eager to explore the area more with her friends. She got separated from Amy when she decided to take a break on the mountain, and a man approached her. He mentioned how he wasn't used to seeing many beautiful girls like her here. What she found strange was that her face was mostly hidden by her ski mask. Lily lied, telling him she was with her boyfriend to make him stop, but something unnerved her when he mentioned having seen her and her friend arrive. Lily didn't think much more about it, pretending she hadn't heard anything, and snowboarded away. It was also when she felt she was snowboarding better than ever. That morning, she returned to the mountain alone to practice. Halfway down, she saw a man from a distance. This time, she hid behind a nearby tree and observed. He was wearing the same jacket and ski boots as the man she met before. But then she noticed something unmistakable, a jagged scar over his eye, which Lily clearly remembered from the way he had looked at her so eerily. That's when she noticed his bag, slung over his shoulder, with a keychain bearing the letter J hanging from it. She felt everything growing strange and ominous, as if by instinct, so she called Amy to leave quickly. When she returned, ready to leave, a snowstorm began outside, trapping them and making it impossible to leave. She grew anxious and scared, locking all the doors. But when night fell, things started to get strange. Later that night, they went to their rooms to sleep. Lily, unable to sleep, stayed up looking at her phone. The house was quiet, but the eerie silence was broken by footsteps on the wooden floor. The sound grew louder, and then she heard something that sent chills down her spine. The doorknob turning. It wasn't her friend, it was someone else. She sat up and called out for Amy. No one answered, and panic started to set in. But she paused, wondering why they were trying to enter her room. She tiptoed to the door, pressed her ear against it, and listened carefully. The footsteps had stopped, and the silence was stifling. Lily quietly unlocked the door and turned the knob, pushing it open as gently as possible. When she cracked the door open, she saw a tall man moving around the house. His shadowy figure loomed in the dim light as he seemed to try to enter their rooms. At first, she couldn't make out his features, but then, under the faint moonlight from the window, she recognized him, the man with the scar over his eye, who had said strange things to her on the mountain. He was also carrying the bag with the J keychain. Terrified, Lily gently shut the door and locked it. She grabbed her phone and quietly called 911, whispering into the phone to avoid being detected. Then, the knocking began deliberate at first, then louder and more forceful. The man was trying to get into her room. She couldn't take it any longer. Lily shouted,
Get out!
She yelled, telling the man she had called 911. The banging stopped, and she heard his voice from the other side of the door.
All right, girl.
His footsteps grew fainter as he walked away. Lily and her friend stayed locked in the room, terrified. Only when the police arrived a few minutes later could they confirm the intruder had left. The next day, Lily noticed something that made her heart race. A keychain had been left on the floor near the front door, possibly dropped by the intruder during his attempt to enter her room. Forensic experts collected it as evidence and found fingerprints on it. They analyzed the prints and matched them to a man with a criminal record known for breaking in, stalking, and harassment. Although the police had a lead, they had not yet located the intruder. The case remained open. Back home, Lily couldn't shake the thought that the man was still out there, She didn't know how he had found them, how long he had been following them, or what he might plan next. The Intruder and Courage. Nikki recalled when he was 9 years old. His parents adopted a dog, wanting him to grow up with a companion to help him learn boundaries and discipline, as well as have a playmate. The dog's name was Charlie, a golden retriever. One night, Nikki woke up past midnight and noticed that Charlie had jumped off the bed and was whining at the door. Nikki got up and went downstairs with Charlie. As he walked through the living room, he felt something pass by him that he couldn't even recognize. Nikki led Charlie out into the backyard and stood by the door, waiting for Charlie to quickly finish and come back inside. But when Charlie came back inside, he turned toward the garage door, walked over, and began sniffing intensely. Soon, Charlie's usual curiosity shifted to something else. He began whining, pacing, and scratching at the door more aggressively, finally looking back at Nikki. Nikki hesitated, but Charlie wouldn't stop. Finally, Nikki opened the door and turned on the light. When the lights came on, there was a man wearing a black mask and dressed in all black, trying to break into Nikki's dad's Mercedes. Beneath him was a black bag full of stolen items. The man turned, startled by the light. Charlie immediately began barking, his deep, ferocious growls echoing through the garage. Nikki screamed for his parents, but within moments, the man reacted quickly, rushing over to grab him and cover his mouth. Charlie barked even louder, his desperation clear as he tried to protect Nikki. "Quiet," the man hissed, dragging Nikki toward the car. Charlie lunged, but the man kicked him out the door, sending him sprawling to the ground. His whimpers filled Nikki with heartbreak. Then the thief threw Nikki hard to the ground, leaving him weak and powerless. He leaned down, threatening him to stay quiet or else. After a moment, Charlie was on the other side of the door, barking again. Meanwhile, the man turned his attention back to the car, using a metal tool to try and pry the lock. Nikki sat frozen, trembling as Charlie's relentless barking continued. Moments later, the door burst open, and Nikki's parents rushed in with Charlie. Nikki's father's face contorted with anger as he took in the scene. "Let my son go," he shouted. The man turned around, grabbed Nikki, and put him in a chokehold. Nikki's father froze, and his face shifted from anger to immediate panic. It wasn't clear why until Nikki realized there was a knife pressed against his neck. The man demanded his parents step back, hand over the car keys, and let him drive away, or else he'd hurt the boy. Nikki's mother tightly held onto Charlie's collar, trying to restrain him as the dog growled and struggled against her grip. "Get the keys," Nikki's father said, his voice tense with fear. Nikki's mother turned toward the house, but her grip on Charlie slipped. The dog broke free and charged toward Nikki. The thief removed the knife from Nikki's neck, and the boy instinctively knew he would point it at Charlie. Acting on instinct, Nikki grabbed the knife and pulled it toward himself, the blade slicing through his fingers in agonizing pain. Charlie lunged forward. His jaws tore through the man's pants and clamped tightly onto his leg, causing him to scream in pain. Nikki's father immediately charged at the thief, pulling Nikki and Charlie away from him. Before the thief could react, his protective instincts took over, and he pinned the intruder to the ground, knocking him unconscious. It wasn't until Nikki's mother intervened that everything finally settled. Nikki could barely recall what happened next. All he knew was that the thief spent a long time in the hospital before being taken into custody. Nikki was also relieved that everyone, including Charlie, escaped without serious injury. Even though Charlie was older, he had proven his boundless love and loyalty to Nikki and the family. Nightmare with the delivery person. I am one of those people who hates ordering food over the phone. My kids always criticize me and call me old-fashioned because rain, thunder, or snow, whenever we order food, I always drive straight to the restaurant. What they don't know is that this isn't just a whim. It's a story that's not exactly a pleasant one. I was 12 years old, and it was one of the first times I was allowed to stay home alone. My parents had gone to a friend's party a few blocks away and decided I was old enough to take care of myself. I was thrilled because I could stay home alone and sleep whenever I wanted. That night, I was allowed to order a pizza by myself. At first, my parents waited for the delivery guy, but he was taking too long, so they had to leave. Seeing how excited I was, they left me some money and headed out. As soon as they left, I turned on the TV and cranked up the volume. I knew it would be a long night, so I took the dog out to the backyard. After my parents left, he finally arrived, very late. I heard the sound of a motorcycle stopping outside my house. I stood up and walked toward the door. Maybe the pizza guy had finally arrived. I opened the door and saw a tall, skinny man with a scruffy, bushy beard holding a pizza box. He looked at me with a strange, almost unsettling expression. At that moment, I was hungry and feeling a little uneasy, so I said,
You're late.
The man stared at me and said,
Hey kid, what's your problem?
I started to feel weird about his behavior. He seemed almost angry, and his body language became more aggressive. At that moment, I got scared and just wanted to avoid anything bad happening. I quickly handed him the money and grabbed the pizza box from his hands. I apologized and quickly closed the door. I was so scared I nearly slammed it shut. But it didn't stop there. Things got worse. He didn't leave but stood there, almost shouting through the front door.
Hey kid, what are you doing? I haven't even counted the money.
All the money is there.
I cried and apologized. At that point, I just begged him to leave and take all the money. There was silence for a moment, but then the man started yelling again, demanding a tip. He lost control, banging on the door with his fists and kicking it when I didn't respond. After a few seconds, just as suddenly as it started, he seemed to get bored and left. My first instinct was to slowly creep toward the door and peek out the nearby window to check if he was really gone. But as I did so, his face suddenly appeared right in front of me, twisted into a crooked smile, and in his hand, he was holding something. When I realized he was holding a baseball bat, I panicked, frantically hiding under the bed, hoping he wouldn't find me. Meanwhile, he pounded on the door with the baseball bat, and after a few strikes at the lock, the door burst open and he entered my house. He went straight to the wardrobe, where I almost hid, and began smashing it violently. If I had hidden there, my entire body would have been destroyed. He left the room and headed straight for the backyard, suspecting I might escape there. My dog immediately attacked him, but at that moment, I heard my dog whimper. I realized something had happened to him, and I couldn't hold back the overwhelming sadness. He moved like a shadow, storming toward where I was hiding, his face twisted in anger.
Where are you, kid? I know you're hiding somewhere.
He yanked the mattress away and began smashing the bed with the bat, as if trying to break the wood and leave me trapped beneath the wreckage. The wood of the bed began to splinter, and the shards dug into my skin. All I could do was scream for help. As if answering my prayers, two of my neighbors burst in from behind and tackled him to the floor. He quickly got back up, grabbing the bat and trying to swing at them, but one of the neighbors managed to wrestle it away. Then he fled immediately. Suddenly, everything went white and I passed out. When I woke up, I found myself in the hospital. My parents were crying in front of me, saying I was lucky to have only minor injuries. I accidentally overheard my parents talking about the man. He had been a convict with a history of violence, and that night, he had fought with a couple and argued with his boss. In the years that followed, I never ordered delivery again after what happened. The terror on Christmas Eve. This incident happened on Christmas Eve, the year Lena was 13. Since she only lived with her dad, and her family usually either didn't celebrate or celebrated Christmas late, she was used to this. For Lena, Christmas Eve was just like any other night. Her dad was a doctor, so he always had to be on call at the hospital during Christmas holidays. That night was no exception. He wasn't home. Lena was watching TV when she heard a knock at the door, so she went to see who it was. Her front door had a peephole, making it easy to see who was outside. A man stood outside wearing a Santa Claus suit, holding a bag and smiling, waving at Lena to open the door. But something about him seemed off. He didn't look neat at all. Lena approached the door, but didn't open it. She found it odd that someone dressed as Santa Claus would come to her house, of all the houses in the neighborhood. He said,
"Hey kid, it's me, Santa Claus. Let me in, and I'll show you."
Maybe other kids would believe him, but Lena knew he wasn't real. Confused and skeptical, because this had never happened before, Lena refused to open the door. The man insisted, saying he had changed the rules this year to give gifts to kids in the neighborhood. But Lena didn't believe him. Instead, she remembered feeling angry while arguing with him. Lena told him she was calling the police. His smile disappeared, and after that, she didn't hear anything else. To be sure, Lena called the police to report him. Unfortunately, they probably didn't believe her and thought she was just an excited kid, hoping Santa Claus would visit. She only knew how to dial 911 and the house number, since it was the 90s and her dad didn't have a mobile phone yet. Lena could only hope the man wouldn't return. But a few minutes later, someone knocked again. When Lena checked, no one was there. She returned to the Christmas tree to continue decorating and wrapping gifts as a surprise for her dad. Lena turned on the TV to watch Christmas specials, which made her feel less lonely. Suddenly, the power went out, leaving the house in darkness. Lena jumped in fright. Now, the only light in the house came from the battery-operated Christmas tree. Then she heard the back door creak open. From the doorway emerged a dark silhouette, slowly advancing. It was the figure of a man. Lena grabbed a flashlight from a nearby drawer and shone it towards the figure. The face revealed was his, the man from earlier, leaning close to her with a sinister grin.
"Here's your surprise gift, little one,"
he sneered. Lena screamed and ran toward the back door, but she couldn't outrun him. He grabbed her hand and yanked her back. Lena sobbed and screamed, begging for mercy, but he showed no remorse. He taped her mouth shut and began tying her up with rope. As her vision blurred, he stuffed her into a large sack he had brought with him and hoisted it over his shoulder. Lena's next-door neighbor, who was walking his dog, happened to see the man. His actions seemed suspicious. The neighbor remembered that Lena lived alone with her father, who was often away, and her father had occasionally asked him to check on her. He cautiously approached with his dog and asked,
"What are you doing out here at this hour? Is everything okay?"
The man, startled, quickly forced a smile and replied,
"Oh, I'm just preparing a surprise for the kids in the neighborhood."
The man hurriedly hid the sack behind his back, stepping away as his eyes darted around. His strange behavior only heightened the neighbor's suspicions. His dog kept barking, as if trying to warn him of something. It was a smart dog, good at sensing trouble. The neighbor noticed the sack behind the man seemed to be moving slightly. Sensing the man was odd, the neighbor remained cautious. He apologized for bothering him and pretended to head back toward his house. He then heard a faint sound resembling crying and immediately knew something was wrong. Without thinking, he rushed toward the man and shoved him hard, causing him to fall onto the grass. The sack fell, and Lena tumbled out onto the grass, her eyes wide with terror. The man tried to flee, but the neighbor quickly pinned him to the ground and held him there until the police arrived. The man remained on the ground, handcuffed and arrested. Lena was safely escorted back home by her neighbor. Her father returned home immediately after hearing the news. That night, Lena learned the true meaning of fear. She hugged her father tightly, knowing she was lucky to have survived a terrifying Christmas Eve. Home alone with a strange stalker. The house sat quietly in the suburban neighborhood, dark and isolated. The rain pattered against the windows, with occasional flashes of lightning hinting at an approaching storm, making everything feel more ominous than usual. Eva was watching a horror movie in the living room. Yet, every now and then, she couldn't help but glance over her shoulder, a part of her always feeling like something might be lurking behind her. After the movie ended, she went about her nightly routine, brushing her teeth, turning off the lights, and heading to bed. However, her peaceful sleep was interrupted around 1 a.m. when she heard a voice downstairs, calling her name. At first, she wasn't sure what was happening. The voice sounded oddly like her sister's, but Eva couldn't be certain, especially since her sister rarely came home. She got out of bed and walked down the hallway. The house was pitch black, the thick silence broken only by the sound of her footsteps. She entered the kitchen. The lights flickered, and Eva saw something. A knife lying on the kitchen floor, one she distinctly remembered cleaning and putting away earlier. She looked around, but no one was there. A few days later, she still hadn't shaken off the feeling. Eva tried to relax by watching TV, and at some point, she fell asleep there. While asleep, she heard a faint rustling noise. It seemed to be coming from the kitchen. A light flickered near the refrigerator. She cautiously approached. The scene sent chills down her spine.
Lily?
She softly called, but there was no response. She moved closer. Her sister appeared to be sitting with her back to the refrigerator, eating something in an almost frantic manner. Something about the way she was eating felt off. She wasn't sure it was really her sister. Exhausted, Eva chuckled to herself, thinking perhaps her sister was just really hungry, trying to steady her trembling hands. She dismissed the thought, assuming it was her sister, and went back to her room, too tired to care. The next morning, before heading to school, Eva saw her sister. Eva asked her about the strange encounter.
Were you okay last night, Lily? Why were you home so late?
Lily looked surprised and confused, unsure of what Eva was talking about. She told Eva that she had worked the night shift and hadn't come home last night. Lily assumed Eva must have been sleepwalking. Eva froze. The woman she saw eating frantically in the kitchen wasn't her sister. But then, who was it? As usual, Eva finished dinner and began tidying up in the kitchen. Suddenly, the lights went out without warning. She stumbled in the darkness, trying to locate the light switch. As her hand reached out for the switch, she felt an icy presence standing behind her. A chill ran down her spine as she glimpsed a reflection in the refrigerator door. It was a figure resembling her sister, grinning unnaturally wide. She thought it must be a hallucination, a trick of her mind. That night, Eva struggled to sleep, tossing and turning in bed. Eventually, she dozed off, but was abruptly awakened by the sensation of the bed shifting beside her. Her eyes flew open in shock. She turned and froze. It wasn't a woman, but a man with a beard sitting on her bed. His lifeless eyes bore into hers as he spoke in a calm, haunting voice.
Eva, my sister.
Eva screamed and bolted from the bed. The man disguised as her sister chased after her, laughing slyly. She ran, desperate to escape. At the door, she fumbled with the handle in panic. Just as she managed to open it, he, still in his disguise, grabbed her arm and laughed triumphantly. Eva struggled, grabbing a lampstand from a nearby shelf and smashing it against his face. She fought her way free and sprinted to a neighbor's house for help. The neighbor helped her call the police, but when they arrived to take him away, he was sitting curled up in fear, then laughing inexplicably in Eva's room. The man, once in custody, confessed that he had been stalking her for a long time, hiding in the shadows. His trauma stemmed from a history of abuse. He had a compulsion to impersonate the people he encountered, believing he was becoming those he wanted to harm, including pretending to be Eva's sister. Eva and her sister finally found peace after the man was arrested, though the experience left emotional scars they could never forget. They comforted each other, knowing the nightmare was finally over. The impersonator of the babysitter. Dylan was home alone, sitting on the couch in the living room, when his mom walked in with Joshua, a thin man who looked nervous. He was 12 years old and believed he was old enough to stay home alone, but his parents insisted on hiring a babysitter. Dylan immediately disliked Joshua, calling him a clumsy loser, a nerd in his head. Joshua tried to be friendly, but his anxiety was clear. His mom handed over the rules for the evening. Joshua had to make sure Dylan ate, didn't stay up too late, and didn't watch horror movies. But Dylan was determined to make everything difficult. He rolled his eyes and agreed reluctantly. Once they left, Dylan turned on a horror movie with gory scenes, deliberately trying to make Joshua uncomfortable. He enjoyed watching Joshua jump at every scare, his face growing paler with each moment. Dylan started suggesting Joshua order a pizza. He almost ran into the kitchen to get away from the TV screen, and Dylan couldn't stop laughing. While he was on the phone ordering, a new, wicked idea popped into Dylan's head. After a while, they got their pizza. But as Dylan observed, something was off in Joshua's behavior. He seemed too anxious, constantly looking over his shoulder and jumping at the slightest noise. Dylan found this strange but shrugged it off, still focused on achieving his goal. Bored and wanting to scare the babysitter, Dylan suggested they play hide and seek in the dark. He thought Joshua would be desperate to escape the horror movie and agreed without hesitation. Things started to get strange. While in the bathroom, Dylan heard the doorbell ring, but he was a little surprised since the pizza was delivered so early. But when he stepped out, he saw Joshua staring at the front door with a scared expression, saying no one was there, and he thought it was the pizza delivery guy. The game started, and Joshua went to hide. Dylan found him after 5 minutes. Dylan asked,
"Why didn't you try hiding in the basement?"
Joshua said,
The dark scares me.
in Dylan's mind, the perfect plan continued to form. Joshua began pressing his face into the wall and counting, while Dylan hid, thoroughly enjoying his plan. The boy hid in the kitchen, secretly holding the TV remote, waiting for the perfect moment. As he started searching and approached the TV, the boy suddenly turned the volume all the way up, the sound of a terrifying scene, nearly giving him a heart attack. That was when the boy thought about hiding in his parents' closet to jump out and scare him. Dylan quietly tiptoed towards the bedroom, opened the closet, and that's when everything went still. Inside the closet was a dead body. It was a man with his head wrapped in a plastic bag, seemingly suffocated. Dylan, in a panic, tried to understand the situation, and suddenly I noticed a wallet sticking out of the man's pocket. The boy reached for it. He found an ID card that read Joshua Miller. If his babysitter, Joshua Miller, was dead in the closet, then the boy had no idea who he was playing hide and seek with. There was a killer in his house. He quickly ran under the bed, trying to steady his breath so the man wouldn't hear him breathing. A pair of feet entered and stopped right in front of the open closet.
Congratulations. It seems like you found your babysitter.
He said. Dylan realized that the game he had set up just minutes ago had now turned into a survival mission, as his life depended on it. The man pretending to be Joshua revealed himself to be Kyle. He had planned to trap Joshua for killing the boy, and now he intended to kill Dylan as well. His face suddenly dipped under the bed, and he screamed.
It's your turn to be like Joshua.
Dylan, in a final desperate moment, ran out from under the bed. Kyle chased him, lunging at him with a knife. The blade ripped his shirt, but luckily it missed.
I thought you liked horror movies.
He mocked the boy.
This is your real-life horror movie, kid.
Dylan fearfully ran into a room and locked the door. Then he heard the doorbell. Through the window, he saw it was the pizza delivery person. Dylan shouted for help.
Call 911 right now.
But before the pizza guy could assess the situation, Joshua ran downstairs, opened the door, and charged at him with a knife. The pizza guy was stronger. After a struggle, he managed to pin Kyle down and snatched the knife from his hand. Kyle was convicted of murder. Dylan's parents rushed home after being contacted by the police. They were also grateful and gave the pizza guy a sum of money to thank him for saving the boy. Dylan's parents never left him alone with anyone again. Whenever they had to go out, he stayed with his grandmother. They would never hire a babysitter again. The horror Dylan experienced that night would stay with him forever. The murderer on Christmas night. Christmas is usually a time of peace and joy, but sometimes it's when the strangest and most terrifying things can happen. The story is about when I was a child. At that time, to be honest, Christmas wasn't my favorite holiday. Sure, the gifts, food, and Santa Claus were great, but somehow, all of that always felt empty to me. While everyone was gathered talking, I went to the dining room to play alone, and that's when everything started. At that time, I thought maybe I had watched too many horror movies, but I swear I saw someone through the window. A shadow passed by the window, just for a second. It was a person, but their face wasn't normal. The man wore a grotesque, demon-like mask. I froze in place. I moved closer to the window to see better, but there was nothing there. I thought maybe it was just my imagination. Then, suddenly, the man lunged forward with the mask, his mouth twisted into a wide, grotesque grin. He gently tapped on the window and pointed at the front door. After that, he moved away from the window and walked toward the front door. A few seconds later, someone began knocking on the door. I ran to warn my dad, but he brushed it off, thinking it was just Uncle Henry bringing in beer. He even joked that I was probably imagining everything because I was bored. My dad hesitated as he stepped toward the door, reluctantly opening it. It was Uncle Henry, which confused me even more. I didn't know what was going on. Despite Uncle Henry's comforting presence, the strange feeling I had didn't go away. I didn't know what to say anymore. I was scared, but my dad seemed to think it was just a prank. My body trembled as I went back upstairs, locked the door, and shoved a chair under the doorknob, trapping myself in my room, trying to escape the growing fear inside me. As night fell, and the family gathered outside to watch the fireworks, I stayed inside, staring out of my bedroom window at the bright lights. Suddenly, someone began knocking on my room door. I was about to open it when I realized something was wrong. I looked back out the window. My mom, dad, grandparents, and uncle were all downstairs. So, who was knocking on the door? I stepped toward the door, my hand trembling as I touched the doorknob. I paused for a second, then looked through the peephole. It wasn't my parents. It was him, the man wearing the demon mask. His voice was deep, but I could still hear it clearly. There was no mistaking it. He insisted that I let him in, promising me horrors if I refused. He even taunted me, threatening to kill me like he had with other children. Terrified, the first refused to open the door, only to hear the door starting to splinter as the masked man tried to break in. I screamed for help, but they outside didn't know the danger lurking inside. In a desperate attempt to cry for help, at the same time, my parents struggled to open the locked back door, which had been mysteriously sealed from the inside. They were panicked, unable to get into the house. As the masked man continued pounding on the door, I watched in horror as the wood began to crack. He was close to getting in, and I could feel my life slipping away. The door shattered, and the man, his face still hidden behind the grotesque demon mask, stepped into the room. He grabbed my neck with terrifying strength. My body writhed, trying to escape his grip. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought this was it. But then, a loud crash sounded from outside the window. He looked up for a moment, distracted. My dad realized the severity of the situation, climbed the ladder to the window, and threw a rock through it. The glass shattered. Without hesitation, my dad climbed through the broken window and rushed into the room just in time to pull him away. He didn't stop there, though. He took a knife and lunged toward my dad. My dad tried to dodge the strike, but the blade grazed his shoulder painfully. Still, he pushed forward. As my dad desperately fought to subdue him, I grabbed a metal lamp from the bedside table and struck him on the head. He staggered back, dazed. Outside, the sound of sirens could finally be heard. We were saved at last. When they caught the man, he referred to himself as the Grinch. They said he was responsible for many child disappearances around my age, and some bodies had been found and buried in his backyard. Since that day, many months later, I still see a therapist because of that man. Every time I sleep, I dream about what would have happened if I hadn't locked my door. I survived, yes, but the nightmares will never leave me. Nightmare Neighbor. The old, tall apartment building stood under the dim glow of the streetlights. It was late, and most windows were dark. Rena was standing outside, staring up at the second floor. Her floor. She had lived here for a few months, and the place had always been quiet, until Arthur moved in next door. Rena's apartment was at the end of the hallway on the second floor, and taking out the trash usually only took a few minutes. But tonight, she felt as though someone was watching her. As she was about to turn the corner at the end of the hallway, he was there. Arthur was standing by his door, looking as though he had been waiting for her. He always found excuses to talk and stand uncomfortably close to Rena. She lowered her head, quickly murmured a greeting, and walked toward the stairs. This time, he said nothing. Goosebumps rose on Rena's skin. Something felt different tonight, making her more uneasy than before. Rena entered her apartment and quickly shut the door. She took a moment to calm herself, telling herself she was overreacting. She turned off the lights in the living room, planning to lie in bed and watch TV. It was late, and she was tired, but she wasn't ready to sleep yet. As she walked past the broom closet, she heard a faint sound, a soft rustling from inside. Her heart skipped a beat, and she froze, staring at the closet door. With trembling hands, she reached for the closet door handle. She hesitated. Then she pulled the door open. Arthur was in there, inside her storage closet. For a moment, time seemed to stop. He was just there, staring at her, unblinking, with a twisted smile on his face. He stepped forward, crawling out of the closet like a predator closing in on its prey. She gasped, stumbling backward, unable to believe what she was seeing. She ran into her bedroom, slamming the door shut. But she didn't have time to lock it. The door burst open, and Arthur was right there, his face wild and unhinged. She dashed toward the bathroom, the only place left to hide. She slammed the door shut just as Arthur reached the bedroom. Her hands fumbled with the lock. Rena's back pressed against the cold bathroom wall. Her breaths came in quick gasps as Arthur pounded on the door, trying to break through. The thin wooden door was the only thing separating her from the man who had been stalking her for weeks. His sickening grin etched deeply into her mind. Thankfully, she had her phone. She clutched it tightly, her fingers trembling as she spoke to the police. Her voice was barely a whisper, strangled by the fear gripping her. Arthur pounded on the door again, the wood splintering under the force. Rena knew it couldn't hold much longer. Suddenly, the pounding stopped. She held her breath, pressing her ear to the door, straining to hear any sound. She didn't know if he had left. Had he given up? Arthur stood outside the bathroom door, his eyes wild with anticipation. His patience had run out. His hand hovered over the doorknob. He knew she was cornered, with nowhere to escape. He slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, gleaming knife. His fingers tightened around the handle. Nightmare neighbor. With a single powerful kick, the bathroom door splintered. The door burst open, and Arthur lunged inside, his eyes wide and feral. She backed away, nearly pressing herself against the wall. She screamed at him to stay away, but Arthur didn't stop. He lunged at her, grabbing her arm with a bruising grip. Rena struggled to pull away, but he was too strong. Pain shot down her spine as he twisted her wrist, pinning it against the wall. Her phone slipped from her grasp, falling to the floor. Arthur's face was only inches from hers as he hissed threats, blaming her for always ignoring him when they crossed paths in the hallway. Rena struggled, trying to break free, but he pulled her closer, squeezing tighter. His knife swiped through the air, grazing her arm. She gasped as a sharp pain tore through her skin, leaving her injured and bleeding. The sound of sirens pierced the night air, growing louder as the police rushed toward the apartment building. The flashing lights reflected on the window, like a beacon of hope in the stifling darkness. Inside, Rena's vision blurred with panic and pain. He shoved her against the wall again, laughing maniacally as he brought the knife closer to her neck. Her free hand flailed, fumbling along the counter by the sink and the shelves, searching for anything she could use to defend herself. She grabbed a glass soap bottle and, without thinking, smashed it against Arthur's head. The glass shattered, and he staggered backward, momentarily dazed. Arthur stumbled, and the knife slipped from his grip, falling to the floor. Rena didn't wait. She bolted for the door, clutching her bleeding arm. She fled the bathroom and into the living room, her mind screaming for escape. But Arthur wasn't far behind. Blood streamed down his face from where the glass bottle had struck him. Enraged, he grabbed the knife from the floor and charged toward her. The police stormed the apartment complex. They knew they had to act fast. Rena reached the living room, but her legs gave out, sending her crashing to the floor. She could feel Arthur's looming presence closing in, the knife still in his hand. His eyes were now filled with rage, the twisted delight in them gone. He reached for her, grabbing her hair. Rena winced in pain, struggling to get up, her body screaming for help. Arthur growled.
There's nowhere left to run, girl.
Just as he raised the knife again, the apartment door burst open with a loud crash. The police stormed into the apartment, cutting through the tension. Arthur stubbornly held on to her, refusing to let her go. Seizing the opportunity, Rena stomped on his foot, making him cry out in pain. She ran toward the police, gasping for breath, blood dripping from her arm, but the nightmare was over. Rena sat on the edge of the ambulance, her mind still reeling, her body in shock. She watched as the police loaded Arthur into the back of the car. The flashing lights of the police car faded into the night as they drove away. The guest at midnight. A few years ago, Jacob applied for a temporary job at a local gas station. He planned to move in 6 months, so he couldn't get a long-term job, but he still needed to make some cash beforehand. The job paid well enough to convince Jacob to take the night shift. All he had to do was man the register and occasionally handle routine maintenance. It was during his 4th month on the job. Most nights were uneventful, but there was one particular customer that stood out to Jacob. His name was Dave. He was a man in his early 40s who regularly stopped by the gas station around 1 or 2 a.m. every night. He would walk in and buy random things, sometimes household items, food, or tools. Occasionally, the things he purchased seemed oddly specific. One night, as usual, at 1 a.m., Dave entered the gas station. There were no other customers, just Jacob, sitting at the counter, waiting for him to walk in. Jacob immediately sensed something was off. Dave looked disheveled, sweating, and frantically searching for something. When he found it a master lock, the kind used for securing bikes, he rushed to the counter and tossed it down for checkout. Dave's strange behavior only made Jacob more curious.
Dave, did you get a new bike?
But Dave didn't even look at him, hastily pulling out cash instead. The night passed, and then several days did too. Jacob hadn't seen Dave in nearly a week, which was strange, considering Dave usually came in every night. It wasn't until Jacob's 4th shift that he saw Dave again. That night, a light drizzle fell outside. As usual, Dave stepped into the store. But this time, he rushed inside, muttering something inaudible. He looked agitated, and Jacob felt an unsettling sense of unease. His gut told him something was wrong. Then, a loud noise came from outside. The only thing there was Dave's car. The sound was sharp, like someone kicking the door from the inside. A second later, Jacob turned back to Dave. He was no longer in a rush. Instead, he stood in the aisle, staring directly at Jacob, like he had just realized something Jacob wasn't supposed to know. After that night, after seeing Dave's car and hearing that strange noise, Jacob knew he couldn't just sit still. He checked the gas station's security cameras, trying to figure out what Dave had been doing on his previous visits. Jacob recalled the items Dave had bought: rope, locks, duct tape. When put together, they all seemed to serve a sinister purpose. Determined not to let this go, Jacob decided to follow Dave. After tracking Dave's car several times, Jacob discovered that he frequently drove to a narrow forest road leading to an abandoned cabin near town. Choosing not to call the police just yet, Jacob drove there himself, bringing a flashlight and a folding knife for protection. As he neared the cabin, Jacob turned off his car's lights and stepped into the forest. Peering through a window, he saw Dave holding a knife, mumbling something to a woman tied to a chair. Jacob silently tried to find a way inside, but he accidentally kicked a log nearby, alerting Dave. He quickly ducked behind a pile of firewood, but Jacob didn't realize Dave had already spotted him. Before he knew it, Dave was right behind him, eyes wild, shouting,
"What the hell are you doing here?"
With no other choice, Jacob lunged at him, initiating a violent struggle. Dave swung his knife at Jacob, but he dodged and shoved him against the wall. The tied-up woman screamed, desperately trying to free herself. Distracted by her cries, Jacob was caught off guard as Dave landed a powerful punch, knocking him to the ground. As Dave charged forward to stab him, Jacob grabbed a nearby wooden plank and smashed it against Dave's head, making him stumble and drop the knife. But things weren't over yet. In the struggle, Dave tried to reach for the knife, but Jacob shoved him backward. He fell into an abandoned pit just outside the cabin. From above, Jacob watched as Dave lay motionless, his breaths growing weaker. Jacob freed the woman, and together they left, abandoning Dave to his fate in the darkness. His reckoning would come soon enough. Escape your pursuer at Dunkin' Donuts. Isa worked the night shift at her uncle's Dunkin' Donuts, a small, quiet spot off a lonely highway, struggling with boredom as a violent storm raged outside. Her phone battery died, flickering before finally shutting off. With a sigh, she plugged it into the charger. The empty Dunkin' Donuts felt eerily quiet. Feeling sleepiness creeping in from the stillness of the night shift, Isa got up and headed to the back to make herself a cup of coffee. Trying to stay alert, Isa sat at the corner table, sipping her coffee. The sound of the storm seemed to press in from all directions, making her feel unusually uneasy in the empty store. Just as she took another sip, the power went out, plunging the store into darkness. The bell above the door rang, signaling someone had entered. Isa froze. She wasn't expecting anyone, especially during this storm. Blinking, she slowly moved toward the counter, the only light coming from a nearby candle. As Isa lifted the candle, the pale face of a woman emerged from the shadows. Her hair was disheveled, her pants torn in multiple places, and her shirt dotted with what looked like dried blood. Isa, horrified, exclaimed,
Oh my God, you scared me. What happened to you? Are you okay?
The woman's eyes were wide with fear, an expression haunted and desperate.
Please.
She gasped.
You have to help me. He's coming. If we don't move fast, he'll kill me.
Before Isa could respond, headlights swept across the window. A blue pickup truck pulled into the parking lot. The woman grabbed Isa's arm with surprising strength for someone so frail.
We need to hide. Now.
Isa led her to the storage room and locked the door. Chaos ensued as the front door of the store opened again, this time revealing a man in his 40s with cold, sharp eyes. Isa forced a smile, trying to stay calm and keep him from suspecting anything.
Good evening. Can I get you something?
The man didn't answer immediately, his eyes darting toward the back room, where the door was slightly ajar.
I'm looking for someone. A woman. She came in here, didn't she?
Isa shook her head and said it was just her there. Isa was on high alert. The man kept his hand fidgeting in his jacket pocket, as if ready to pull something out at any moment. He seemed unconvinced and stepped closer to the counter, his cold, calculating eyes fixed on her.
Are you sure?
Things felt wrong. Before Isa could respond, the backroom door burst open. The woman dashed out, holding a fire extinguisher.
Run!
She shouted as she sprayed water into his face, then unleashed a torrent of foam, forcing the man to stagger back, momentarily blinded. They grabbed a baseball bat from behind the counter and bolted out the back door into the raging storm, disappearing into the pitch-black night. Freezing, they ran toward the woods. The man wasn't far behind, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness as he shouted threats. Finally, they found an abandoned wooden cabin, dilapidated and isolated, its door hanging loosely on its hinges. They immediately began barricading the door with an old table.
What now?
Isa whispered. The woman pulled out a small knife from her pocket and told Isa that, if necessary, they would face him. She had been running from him for weeks and decided it was time to stop hiding. He arrived and began pounding on the door, trying to force his way in. Isa and the woman exchanged a look, bracing for whatever would happen next. He burst through the door. The woman charged at him, knocking him off balance. Isa, trembling but determined, swung the baseball bat hard at his head. He collapsed to the floor, dazed. The woman quickly grabbed a rope from the cabin and tied the man up while Isa used his phone to call the police. When the police arrived, they uncovered horrifying evidence in his truck, tools for murder and belongings from previous victims, women he had kidnapped and tortured. As the storm began to dissipate, it was finally over. They turned to each other and smiled. Escape from the terrifying snowstorm night. This happened a few New Year's Eves ago. I was driving to my parents' house to celebrate the new year with them. A simple trip. I was used to long drives. Snow started falling about an hour into the drive. Light at first, but it kept coming until I found myself in the middle of a snowstorm. The highway grew slippery, and visibility dropped to near zero. My car, a small one, wasn't built for driving in the snow. The tires slid even on the smallest incline, and I realized I needed to stop. I texted my parents about my situation to reassure them, but honestly, I wasn't so sure myself. An hour passed, and the snow only got worse. I began worrying about running out of gas or draining the battery by keeping the heater on too long. I kept the engine running, hoping the storm would ease. The wind howled outside. I began to feel the weight of isolation when I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw headlights cutting through the storm behind me. I felt an overwhelming relief as a snowplow stopped beside me. Finally, someone had come to help. The truck slowed and stopped beside me. It was the driver, a man leaning out the window. He was an older man, perhaps in his late 50s, wearing a thick coat and a black knit cap pulled down over his ears. I expected him to say something, but he just stared at me for an uncomfortably long moment. His voice was hoarse, like someone who had smoked for years.
Are you okay?
He asked. I told him I didn't think my car could handle the conditions, and he said to get in, that he'd take me somewhere safe. He got out of the truck. I hesitated. I didn't know this man, and he seemed a little strange, but he appeared sincere. The storm was relentless, and staying wasn't an option. All right, I replied, then asked if he could take me to my destination. He didn't answer right away, his eyes darting quickly behind my car, as if looking for something. Then, without a word, he told me to get in. The warmth inside the snowplow was a relief compared to the biting cold outside. We didn't talk much during the ride, but as the minutes passed, I began to sense something strange. As I glanced out the window, I realized we weren't heading toward my parents' house. The surroundings looked unfamiliar. A lingering unease crept in. I asked, trying to sound casual, "Are we going the right way?" The driver didn't look at me and said it was a shortcut. At least GPS showed we were going the right way, so I figured I was just being paranoid. I glanced around the truck. Everything was a mess. Empty whiskey bottles and torn maps stuffed into the side compartments. My eyes stopped at something wedged between the seats. A knife, half hidden under the chair. Suddenly, I saw a small house ahead, the only house I'd seen after a long stretch of emptiness. I knew I had to act before something bad happened. A sense of foreboding washed over me. I waited until we got closer, took a deep breath, grabbed the door handle, and kicked the door open as hard as I could. I flung the door wide and ran into the snowstorm. The blizzard made visibility almost zero. The thick snow slowed my steps, but I pressed on toward the faint light of the wooden house. Behind me, I could hear him shouting, but I didn't stop. The snowplow driver didn't give up. He rummaged through the glove compartment and pulled out a handgun, yelling,
"Get back here! You're not going anywhere!"
As I neared the house's door, he fired the gun. I thought I'd used up all my luck when the bullet grazed my shoulder, leaving a painful wound. Staggering, I banged on the wooden door, shouting for help. A man appeared with a shotgun in hand. Before I could explain, he seemed to understand and quickly pulled me inside, slamming the door shut. He stayed outside, shouting, his eyes wild and unrelenting. He fired the gun again, the bullet shattering a large piece of the window. The hunter, with no other choice, opened the door and charged outside with the shotgun. The two of them wrestled in the blizzard, the gun falling from their hands. I couldn't just stand there. Before he could act, I picked up the shotgun and aimed it straight at him. As he hesitated, the hunter took the opportunity to tackle him to the snow-covered ground and tied him up with a rope. A short while later, the police arrived, and he was arrested. I was so grateful to the hunter for saving me, and relieved I had made the right decision to jump out of that truck. The echo of the forgotten sonata. Silver Hollow was known for its quiet streets, friendly faces, and a sense of safety. But the highway just outside its borders told a different story. For months, drivers had vanished without a trace, and rumors of a masked figure haunting the lonely stretch of road began to spread. Locals whispered about this mysterious stalker, but no one had seen him close enough to describe. Nick Hollis, an investigator, was assigned to go undercover as a long-haul truck driver to uncover the truth behind these mysterious disappearances. Nick was skeptical. A wholesome-looking town like Silver Hollow didn't seem like the hiding place of a serial killer. He didn't know if the road and the small town were connected, but highways didn't lie, and the rising number of disappearances demanded answers. Although he lived in the town, he had never noticed anything strange about it. Most people were genuinely kind. His cover was simple: a new truck driver passing through the area, taking odd routes to make a living. He disguised himself and rented a small apartment on the edge of town. During the day, Nick observed the locals, casually chatting at diners or gas stations. Everyone was polite, almost overly friendly, as if trying to erase any doubt. But unease settled in at night as the highway stretched endlessly into darkness, lit only by the occasional flicker of headlights. It was Nick's third night on the highway. Suddenly, a figure darted across the road, briefly illuminated by the truck's headlights. He slammed the brakes, the truck skidding slightly before coming to a halt. His mind raced. Who would be out here at this hour? He grabbed a flashlight and stepped out, scanning the roadside. As the flashlight swept across the ground, Nick spotted something wedged under a nearby rock, a crumpled piece of paper. He hesitated, then stepped forward and bent down to pick it up. The paper read, "Turn back. You won't find them alive." A chill ran down his spine. He swept the flashlight across the area again, but saw no one. Nick hurried back to his truck. He glanced at the rearview mirror again, but all he saw was the dark highway stretching behind him. The note felt like a warning, and Nick knew he couldn't ignore it. The following night, Nick parked his truck at a small rest stop along the highway to get a better vantage point. Around 2 a.m., he noticed a car with its lights off creeping along the road, as if trying to avoid detection. Nick started his truck and followed from a distance. The car turned onto a dense, overgrown path leading away from the highway. Nick parked nearby, grabbed his binoculars, and observed. A masked man stepped out of the car, dragging a heavy-looking bag. He disappeared into the trees. Nick's instincts kicked in, and he quietly followed on foot, keeping his distance. After a few minutes, he spotted the man crouched by a small fire, rummaging through the bag's contents, wallets, phones, and jewelry. Nick crept closer, careful not to make a sound. His plan was to observe long enough to identify the man and his habits, then report back. But as he moved, a twig snapped under his foot. The masked man said,
"Who's there?"
Nick raised his hands in surrender.
"Just a truck driver passing through. Got lost."
The masked man stood up, holding a knife.
"This road isn't for wandering. You should leave,"
he muttered before vanishing into the woods. Nick immediately called for backup, and a quick search of the area uncovered a stash of stolen goods. 2 days later, the masked man was caught and identified as a petty thief who had been robbing and extorting travelers. Nick's instincts told him this man wasn't responsible for the disappearances. The thief's petty crimes were nothing compared to the horrors the missing travelers had faced. After capturing the masked thief on the highway, Nick couldn't shake the unease in his mind. The petty thief's words echoed in his memory. The real monster isn't dumb enough to get caught. He started noticing inconsistencies. A house with windows perpetually shut. A place he often passed but never saw anyone. Upon investigation, he realized it was his cousin Derek's house, who lived on the town's outskirts. Derek had always been approachable, someone Nick trusted. But during a casual visit to Derek's house, Nick sensed something was off. Derek's home was cozy, adorned with old family photos, and faintly smelled of wood. While chatting over coffee, Nick's sharp detective instincts picked up on strange details. Scratches on the floor near a cabinet, an unusual lock on the basement door, and a faint metallic scent in the air. While Derek excused himself to take a call, Nick wandered through the living room, his curiosity growing. A framed photo on the mantel caught his attention. It was a picture of Derek standing with a group of locals, including a man reported missing months ago. That night, Nick pretended to leave but parked his truck nearby, watching. Using his lock-picking skills, Nick snuck around the back and gently opened the door. Nick opened the basement door and descended the stairs. The stench hit him first, a nauseating mix of damp earth and decay. The dim light from a single bulb revealed a chilling scene. Rows of Polaroids were pinned to the walls, some showing missing persons from case files, all in varying states of fear and distress. A bloodied tarp covered something large on the floor. Nearby were necklaces, wallets, and torn jackets scattered carelessly. The basement resembled something out of a nightmare. Rows of industrial freezers lined the walls, each labeled with dates and names. A workbench was filled with surgical tools, knives meticulously arranged. As Nick turned to leave, he heard footsteps above. Derek's voice rang out, calm but chilling.
You weren't supposed to see this, Nick.
Derek appeared at the top of the stairs, holding a shotgun, his face devoid of its usual warmth. He revealed his twisted reasoning, claiming he was protecting the town by ensuring no locals came to harm. Knowing he couldn't reach his concealed weapon, Nick noticed a toolbox on a nearby shelf. Inside, he spotted a flashlight with a cracked lens and a reflective object sticking out of the corner, an old mirror. He began forming a plan. Nick stepped back toward the toolbox, feigning nervous compliance.
At least let me clean up the mess I've made, Derek. Let me pull the tarp back.
As Nick knelt to adjust the tarp, he discreetly grabbed the mirror from the toolbox. Using the flashlight's cracked lens to create a distraction, he angled the mirror to reflect the light from the overhead bulb. Nick raised the flashlight, aiming it at Derek. The cracked lens split the beam, momentarily blinding and distracting him with a sudden burst of light. As Derek instinctively stepped back, Nick lunged toward a nearby shelf, knocking over a stack of paint cans. The heavy cans tumbled down, causing Derek to stagger and drop the shotgun. Nick slammed the basement door shut and locked it from the outside, using a nearby chair to block the handle. Wasting no time, he pulled out his phone and called for backup. Authorities arrested Derek and seized the horrifying evidence from the basement. Inside the freezers were packages labeled as meat, but peeling back the layers revealed severed hands and feet, meticulously wrapped and disturbingly labeled. Even as the case was closed, Nick couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness of Silver Hollow ran deeper than his cousin's monstrous deeds. The secret buried in the basement. This is a true story, something that happened to me when I was a child, but to this day, I'm still haunted when I think about it. I lived in a suburban neighborhood back then, right next to a childhood friend named Ben and his little sister Maggie. We would always play together, especially in their front yard. Even then, I could tell something wasn't right. Ben and Maggie always looked skinny and malnourished, and their clothes were always old and tattered. Their house, too, was a sight that scared me. The lawn was overgrown, windows cracked, and the walls eaten away by termites. I always assumed it was because their mother had passed away years ago, and the house hadn't been cared for since. Speaking of their father, I was always terrified of seeing him. He was muscular, with horrible burn scars. It wasn't just his appearance. His voice was always angry, and he constantly yelled at them. One time, when we were playing in the front yard, he came home unexpectedly and scolded Ben for letting me onto their property. He grabbed me by the collar and threatened to give me a beating if he ever saw me near their house again. I panicked and cried the whole way home after that incident. After a while, I completely stopped seeing Maggie. She just disappeared. I feared that something terrible had happened to her. I overheard my parents talking about Ben's father. He was a veteran who had been dishonorably discharged after massacring a village full of innocent civilians. Another strange thing was that the body of his wife, Ben's mother, was never found. There were rumors that he had killed her too. Ben and I continued to play together, even though my parents warned me not to. One of his favorite games was hide and seek. Ben was a master at it. One day, while we were playing hide and seek in the yard, Ben suggested something crazy, playing hide and seek inside his house. I was hesitant, but honestly, a part of me had always been curious about what the inside of their house looked like. So, I agreed and went in. As I had expected, the place was a mess. Broken light bulbs, empty beer cans in every corner, and food stains on the walls. It looked more like a refuge camp than a house. Then I noticed something suspicious. The basement door was locked and chained shut. Ben told me I could hide anywhere, including the upstairs bedrooms, but I was never allowed to go into the basement, under any circumstances. I found the perfect hiding spot, an old, large wooden wardrobe. I slipped inside and shut the door. As I leaned back against the wall, it shifted. Losing my balance, I fell right through the cracked wall and tumbled into a dark place, what seemed like the basement. I stood up and tried to find my way out. The fear was overwhelming, and I couldn't stay calm. The stuffed animals mounted on the walls seemed to be staring at me. Then I heard crying coming from a chain door in the basement. I slowly moved closer and peeked through the crack in the door. I was shocked to see Maggie chained to a furnace. She had wounds all over her body and looked like she hadn't eaten in days. Before I could react, I heard the basement door open. Ben's father had returned and was coming down the stairs. I quickly hid behind a large shield. He spotted my footprints and immediately knew someone else was in the basement. He searched for me, coming within inches of my hiding spot before Ben came down the stairs, distracting him. He grabbed Ben by the collar and shouted angrily. I seized the opportunity to sneak out, but not before exchanging a quick look with Ben. As soon as I got home, I told my parents everything that had happened. Within hours, Ben's father was arrested. It turned out he had been punishing them by locking them in the basement without food or water for days. He was suffering from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and had taken his rage out on his children. Afterward, Ben and Maggie were sent to live with their aunt in North Carolina. I never saw or heard from them again. Message on the mirror. Lily was living in an old apartment, a temporary home. The unique feature of the apartment was the mirrors. They reflected every corner of the space. Some were framed with antique designs, while others appeared worn and aged. Although Lily found them beautiful, they sometimes exuded a strange, unsettling feeling. Lily sat on the couch, reading a book. The apartment was enveloped in silence. Suddenly, Lily stopped. She heard footsteps. She sat still, listening. The sound continued, but when she looked around the room, no one was there. She shivered, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. Lily got up and glanced at the mirrors along the hallway. In the dim light, each mirror reflected her image, but with a strange distortion. A slight chill ran down her spine, but she ignored it. Lily stood in front of the bathroom mirror. The overhead light flickered as she washed her face, but she stopped when she saw something strange in the reflection. There was a shadow, resembling a man, pressed against the window. His face was obscured, but the outline of his body was unmistakable. Lily quickly turned around, but the bathroom was empty. A wave of fear washed over her. The unsettling feeling grew stronger. At night, she felt she wasn't alone, as if someone was standing just outside her line of sight, watching her. One night, just before bed, she went to the living room to watch TV. Then the feeling returned. She was tense, filled with fear, unsure if she was imagining it, but she saw it, a hand sliding past the curtain. Lily cautiously stood up and turned to look. The curtain swayed, but there was nothing behind it. Her breathing quickened, and a cold, heavy sensation filled the room. Then suddenly, from behind her, a shadow emerged from the darkness. It was unmistakably the figure of a man. He wore filthy, tattered clothes, his face gaunt and pale. He said nothing, only stared at Lily as if waiting for her to act. Her legs trembled, but she forced herself to move toward the door. Lily ran down the hallway. She reached the front door, fumbling with the lock. She glanced back to see the man's eyes, filled with amusement, a satisfied smile on his face as he watched her every move. She struggled to open the door, bursting out into the night, gasping for air. Her legs gave out as she stumbled down the stairs. She stood at the building's entrance, breathing heavily, asking for help from those around. They helped her call the police. The police arrived within minutes and stormed into the apartment. She told them about the man, about what she had seen inside, but they seemed skeptical. Everything in the apartment was untouched, and nothing was missing. There were no signs of forced entry. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The red and blue lights of the police cars flashed across the old building, leaving her alone once again. Lily stood outside, unable to bring herself to go back inside. She looked up at her apartment window, and for a moment, she thought she saw a faint figure standing there, watching her from behind the glass. She shivered, knowing she couldn't stay there any longer. It was time to pack up and leave for good. A few days later, she returned to the house. Lily stepped out of the car, taking a deep breath. She was here one last time to gather her belongings before leaving this strange place forever. Message on the mirror. The hallway seemed darker than before. The dim lights flickered weakly as she walked down the narrow corridor, her footsteps echoing faintly. Lily paused for a moment before the door, hesitating as her hand hovered over the doorknob. Then she slowly opened the door and stepped inside. The familiar chill hit her as she entered the apartment. She was ready to leave this place behind. As she walked through the living room, she caught a glimpse of herself in one of the mirrors. Her reflection looked almost unfamiliar, distorted by the unease she felt. Lily looked away, trying to focus on packing her belongings. Walking down the hallway, she came across an old mirror covered in dust, one she had never noticed before. It sat at the end of the hallway, almost forgotten beneath its dusty covering. She moved closer to the mirror. It was coated with a thick layer of dust, but something about it drew her attention. Slowly, she pulled the cloth away. She shuddered at what she saw. Written faintly in the dust on the mirror were the words, "Hello," and just below it, "I like you." Lily held her breath as she stared at the mirror. Had it always been there? She tried to reason with herself, convincing herself. It must have been there for a long time. She shook her head, trying to ignore the growing paranoia. Lily went into the bedroom, hastily gathering her belongings to pack and leave. As she passed the bathroom, a sudden chill ran down her spine. She stopped, slowly turning her head to look inside. Lily's heart skipped a beat. The bathroom sink faucet was running. She was certain she hadn't left it on. She cautiously stepped into the bathroom, her eyes fixed on the mirror. A message appeared on the fogged glass. "You are mine." Lily froze in terror. She had heard horror stories about people secretly living in others' homes. Was she unknowingly a victim? Trembling, she reached out to turn off the faucet. Slowly, she extended her hand and touched the surface of the mirror. She was shocked to feel a small latch, and the mirror suddenly moved, swinging open like a door. Lily staggered backward as the mirror revealed a hidden space behind it, larger and darker than she could have ever imagined. Then her heart nearly stopped. A face emerged from the darkness. It was a man, his hair disheveled, his wide eyes and a toothy grin, the shadows seemingly swallowing his body, making him appear as just a floating head. Below, the floor was cluttered with clothes, various trash, and some personal belongings. Panic surged through her. Lily turned, grabbed her keys, and bolted out of the bathroom. Lily burst through the front door of the building. She ran to her car, slammed the door shut, locked it, and called the police. The police arrived quickly. The man was eventually caught, still wearing that unnerving, unnatural smile. The police searched the apartment. They discovered a hidden space behind the bathroom mirror containing personal items, canned food, and things Lily recognized as her own. The man had been living there, watching her, moving around the apartment whenever she was out. When they apprehended him, he refused to explain or answer any questions from the police, sometimes sulking, other times aggressive, appearing mentally unstable. Lily felt incredibly lucky that the man was merely an agitated intruder and not a murderer. Otherwise, things could have been far worse. She started the car, glancing at the apartment one last time. Then she drove away, leaving the apartment and its horrors behind. Vengeance of the soul. It was Saturday night, and Hannah was still at her university library, finishing a project due next week. Her friend had ditched her again, leaving her to finish it all on her own. She checked the clock and saw it was nearly 10 p.m., so she closed her textbooks and returned them to the shelf. Hannah went back to the table and put her books in her bag, and at that moment, she heard a noise. She looked around and thought she saw a man staring at her, but when she blinked, he was gone. Hannah left and headed home. She knew she shouldn't wander alone in a new city. Then she heard footsteps behind her and turned around, seeing a figure in a dark hoodie disappearing into an alleyway. She stopped, feeling a surge of fear. Was someone following her? She hurried on, relieved that her apartment was nearby. Hannah got into her building safely. She stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the 14th floor. Just as the doors were closing, someone reached in to stop them. She held her breath as the doors opened, and a tall, fairly handsome man stepped into the elevator, his dark eyes looking at her with a warm expression. He started a friendly conversation, complimenting her outfit. She blushed, feeling a bit nervous. The elevator stopped on the 13th floor, and he stepped out, looking back at her and saying, "See you around." But as the doors started to close, Hannah saw him reach into his coat and pull out a shiny knife. Realizing the danger, she pulled out her phone as the elevator reached her floor. But just as she dialed the last digit for the police, the doors opened again. She screamed as she saw the man standing at the door, with nowhere left to run. He plunged the knife into her chest, her sweater soaking with blood. Pain spread across her chest as everything faded to black. The next morning, neighbors found Hannah dead in the elevator. Residents raised concerns about safety measures. Security cameras were installed, and more importantly, an emergency stop button was added to the elevator. Months passed, and the elevator killer remained uncaught. He prided himself on getting away with the perfect murder and wondered if he could pull it off again in the same building. He chose another Saturday night and saw a woman waiting to enter the elevator. He stood behind her, ensuring the guard was still distracted by his game on his phone. He pulled his hoodie tighter over his head as he noticed the camera. The doors opened, and the woman stepped inside. Just like before, she pressed 14, and he said he lived on the 13th floor as he pressed the button. But the woman didn't respond. She seemed strange, her head bowed, her hair covering most of her face. She wore a white dress and was barefoot, which he found odd, but her appearance didn't concern him. He kept a knife in his pocket, eager to use it. The 13th floor arrived, and he began to step out. He was ready to repeat what he'd done before, but as he turned back, he realized she was no longer in the elevator. Confusion crossed his face. He was certain she'd been there, but now the elevator was empty. He went in to check. The elevator door suddenly closed, and the overhead lights crunched and dimmed. He heard a hiss. The man felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up as a chill ran down his spine. The guy looked up, and his eyes widened. The woman was crawling on the ceiling, her hair growing long and slithering like a snake. Her eyes were bloodshot, and her smiling mouth revealed many sharp teeth. He noticed a blood stain on her sweater and realized she was Hannah, the woman he had murdered. Hannah's spirit reached out, grabbing his neck, savoring his terror. Then Hannah pulled him into her bloody mouth, her razor-sharp teeth waiting for him. His screams echoed within the metallic confines of the elevator, but no one heard. The killer became nothing more than a memory, consumed by the very spirit he had created. Hide and seek in an abandoned house. Today, I decided to ignore my parents' warnings and meet up with my friends to play hide and seek in the old abandoned house near the woods. I remember everything clearly: the musty air, the creaking floors, and the thrill that washed over me as we sneaked into the dilapidated building. Jack, Rian, Lexi, and I. We loved adventure and the adrenaline rush, but nothing could compare to the mystery of that house. The house was surrounded by barbed wire, with the gate tightly locked, but we found a small hole in the wall, hidden behind overgrown grass, just big enough for us to crawl through one by one. As soon as I stepped inside, I felt something was off, but I couldn't pinpoint what it was. We decided to play hide and seek. It was my turn to seek, so I closed my eyes and started counting. The others scattered throughout the house, laughing, their footsteps echoing through the empty rooms.
98, 99, 100.
I opened my eyes and immediately went searching for my friends. It didn't take long to find Lexi and Rian, but Jack was different. He was always better at hiding. I searched every nook and cranny, every room, until I caught a glimpse of a shadow darting by.
Got you, Jack.
I mumbled and ran after him. But something was strange. The shadow seemed faster, slipping around corners as if leading me on. My excitement turned into doubt and fear. No matter how close I thought I was, the shadow always evaded me, disappearing just as I was about to catch up. Not long after, Jack finally came out of the master bedroom, scratching his head. He apologized, saying he had hidden in the closet and fallen asleep. But my heart skipped a beat. Who had I been chasing? I gasped and told Jack and the others what had happened. They laughed, teasing me for trying to scare them. Determined to prove it, I convinced them to play again. We played again. I resumed searching, but soon that uneasy feeling returned. The house was too quiet, too still. My friends were nowhere to be found, and the more I searched, the more convinced I became that something terrible had happened. Then I saw it again. A hand reached out from behind a wall, waving at me from a distance. Suddenly, I noticed a pair of shoes on the ground, just like Lexi's. I called out, but she didn't answer. The hand waved at me again from afar. I moved closer, But as I approached, the hand disappeared. I chased after it, only to find another arm waving from the top of the stairs. No matter how fast I ran, I couldn't find anyone. Then I saw a face that looked like Rion's in the window. He stood still, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. I knew something was wrong. I pressed my face against the window to get a closer look, and it was a child, about our age, but with a wrinkled, aged face, eerie and twisted. His clothes were stained with red patches, and I froze when I saw him holding something, a long, rusted, sharp metal rod. Before I could move, he spoke in a chilling voice.
"Oh, you found me. Now it's my turn."
He grinned widely, then began counting.
1, 2, 3.
Panic surged through me. I didn't take the steps one by one. I bolted down the stairs as fast as I could. His laughter echoed behind me. I remembered the secret closet Jack had hidden in earlier. In desperation, I dove inside, pulling the door shut and holding my breath as I listened. I didn't dare make a sound. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying he would leave. I must have passed out from lack of oxygen. When I woke up, I was in the hospital. It turned out my parents and the police had been searching for us all night, and my friends had managed to escape to alert them. Later, we found out that he was the escaped mental patient the police had been searching for. Because he was as short as a child, he had crawled through the hole in the back wall and turned the abandoned house into his temporary hideout. His favorite thing to do was play hide and seek with children, and then harm them in various ways. The most terrifying part, the police still haven't caught him. Haunting delivery trip. I was working for a food delivery platform on weekends to make some extra money. Between my main job and this side gig, I often felt exhausted. It was past 9 p.m. when I started my shift, picking up small orders and delivering them to random houses. After my first delivery, I drove around the area for a while, waiting for something to come through. 20 minutes passed with nothing. Just as I was about to give up, my phone buzzed with an order for just 1 tacos and a drink. I confirmed the order and headed to the restaurant to pick it up. After grabbing the order, I began the 10-minute drive to the customer's house. It was a normal neighborhood, nothing unusual. As I approached a red light, I noticed a pickup truck stop next to me. Instinctively, I glanced over. The guy in the truck was leaning out of the window, staring straight at my car. I looked away when the light turned green and pressed the gas. I glanced in my rearview mirror. The truck was now in my lane, driving a short distance behind me. As I approached the neighborhood where I was making the delivery, the truck was still behind me. Was he following me? The route was mostly straight, so I wasn't sure if he was just heading in the same direction. I tried to stay calm, but the moment I turned into the neighborhood, I knew. The pickup truck turned in too. Maybe he lived here, I thought. I continued driving through the quiet suburban streets, following the GPS until I reached the final road, a dead end. I braked and parked on the side of the road near the house number I had to deliver to. The truck followed and parked behind me. I sat there, frozen, trying to come up with a plan for the worst-case scenario. What was this guy doing? Was he really following me? I glanced at my phone and saw a message from the customer asking, "When will the food arrive?" Could it be the guy in the truck? Was he the customer waiting for me to step out? I felt more trapped than ever. The man got out of the truck. My heart pounded as I watched him slowly approach my car. He stopped right by my trunk, his face partially hidden in the shadows. Then, out of nowhere, he grabbed something like a metal rod and slammed it into my rear windshield. The glass shattered around me. I screamed and, without thinking, instinctively slammed my foot on the gas. The man jumped onto the back of my car, nearly lying flat as he tried to crawl through the shattered window. I swerved sharply, making a U-turn, and felt him fall off the car. My hands trembled as I maneuvered between the trucks. In the rearview mirror, I saw him stumbling in the street as I sped away. My hands shaking, I picked up the phone to call the police. By the time the police arrived, the man had vanished. All they found were shards of glass scattered across the road. They searched the area, but he was gone. I stood staring at the cracks in my shattered windshield, and memories of the terrifying experience replayed in my mind. I was lucky to have escaped, but deep down I still felt uneasy because he was still out there, haunting delivery trip. It's been almost a month since that horrifying night. I haven't driven for the delivery app since then. Every time I think about driving, the echo of shattering glass floods my mind. I try to tell myself it was just an incident, that I was unlucky. There were no witnesses. The police reassured me they'd find him, saying it was probably just a disturbed person trying to scare me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there had to be some reason he was following me. I decided to try driving again. I needed the money, and I couldn't let fear control my life. I told myself that this time I'd be careful and avoid driving too late at night, and I'd stay away from isolated neighborhoods. As I got into the car, that familiar fear washed over me. My hands were sweaty. I tried to close my eyes, take a deep breath, and turn the key in the ignition. Things started off fine. I was careful and checked my mirrors more frequently. But as the sun set, my phone buzzed with an order that sent a chill down my spine. 1 taco and a drink. A simple order, just like that night. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the accept button. I figured it was just a coincidence, so I accepted the order. A light drizzle had begun. The drive to Taco felt eerie, as if I was retracing the same steps as that night. I picked up the order and placed it on the passenger seat. As I drove to the delivery address, waves of anxiety hit me. The house was in a different neighborhood, but each turn felt strangely familiar. When I parked at the curb, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The headlights of a car behind me suddenly flicked on. I looked, it was a truck, and it looked just like the one from that night. Panic set in as the truck rolled closer, its blinding headlights on full beam. The truck parked right behind me, as if waiting for me to make a move. I tried to text my customer, but I was shaking so badly I couldn't type properly, wasting precious time. Suddenly, a notification popped up on my phone. Customer, when will my order arrive? I couldn't believe it and dropped my phone right then. It was happening again. Could he have been waiting for this moment to get revenge? I couldn't go through this again. I had to act. I pressed the gas, moving my car to another spot. The truck slowed down behind me, its headlights glaring blindingly in my rearview mirror, causing me to squint. Suddenly, the truck surged forward, crashing into the back of my car. The impact jerked me forward, my chest slamming into the steering wheel. Pain shot through my ribs as I gasped, trying to catch my breath. I pressed the gas harder, but the rain had made the road slick, so I had to maintain control to avoid crashing. Panic hit me as he pulled up alongside, rolled down his window, and gave me a sinister smile. Another slam. The back of my car crumpled, and I felt something wet trickling down my head. My head had been injured and was bleeding from the impact against the window when he rammed me again. I braked hard, dazed, my vision blurring from the blood running down my face and the sharp pain in my side. But I couldn't give up. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 for help. I could see his silhouette through the rain, stepping out of his truck. I refused to give up, flooring the gas and driving blindly. My car slammed into a tree. Desperate to survive, I fumbled for the door handle, trying to get out before he got too close. In the distance, I could hear him screaming angrily. I forced myself to run, sprinting toward the woods at the edge of the road. Suddenly, I tripped. My ankle twisted and sharp pain shot up my leg. I couldn't move. He was almost on top of me, his shadow looming as I tried to crawl toward the edge of the road. I turned to face him. He raised the crowbar high above his head, ready to strike, and I screamed. But then, the sound of police sirens cut through the quiet rain. He froze, trying to run, but it was too late. The police used a taser and tackled him to the ground. He was finally caught. I fainted, slowly losing consciousness. Paramedics loaded me into an ambulance, and a wave of relief washed over me. The nightmare was finally over. Weird night at school. I work the night shift as a janitor at a local school. This job is quite fitting for someone who enjoys solitude. Just me, the empty school, and my mop bucket. I only talk to my coworker when absolutely necessary. Most of the time, we divide the school and don't see each other during the entire shift. One night, the school was completely silent. The only sound was the occasional echo of my mop hitting the floor. I've done this 1,000 times, but something about this night felt different, as though something was watching me from the darkness. I brushed it off and kept cleaning. I put on headphones, playing music low enough to still hear if someone was around, but everything seemed normal. I took a break to change the water in my mop bucket. When I returned, I noticed something strange. The wet floor sign I had placed earlier had fallen over. I sighed and stepped forward to pick it up, but that's when I saw them. Small, wet footprints leading away from the sign and down the hallway. I followed the footprints, which led to the staircase heading up to the second floor. I stopped, trying to listen for any sound. Then, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. It was fast, a flicker of motion at the end of the hallway. I rushed to the end of the hallway, but no one was there. At that moment, I heard faint laughter, the giggling of a child. It echoed through the empty school, sending a chill down my spine. I turned, searching for the source, but saw no one. A loud crash suddenly broke the silence. The sound came from the first floor. My mop bucket had been tipped over, spilling water into a large puddle. My blood boiled with frustration. Someone was messing with me, and I wasn't in the mood for games. I grabbed a dry mop and started cleaning up. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched as I tried to figure out what was happening. Were there students still in the building? Had someone snuck in after hours? I decided to talk to my coworker. Maybe she had seen something too. She laughed and told me I was joking with her. She looked at me, completely puzzled, shaking her head. I've been here the whole time. I couldn't make sense of it. I left her workspace and went back to finish my shift. Another hour passed. I was trying to make up for lost time when, without warning, the entire school went dark. For a moment, I was surrounded by darkness. Then the emergency lights flickered on, bathing everything in a dim red glow. It felt like the entire building had turned into a horror movie set. I knew where the electrical room was, so I decided to head there. But before I could reach it, I heard a scream, my coworker's scream, echoing through the school, filled with terror. I ran toward the electrical room, fear welling up inside me. When I reached the door, I noticed it was slightly ajar. When I pushed the door open, I expected to see my coworker inside. Instead, there was a figure standing in the dark. I couldn't tell who it was, but something about it felt off. The figure moved closer. Before I could pull out my phone, it lunged forward and slammed the door shut in my face. Panicked, the first ran away. I needed to find my coworker. When I reached her area, her mop bucket was lying in the middle of the hallway, but she was nowhere to be found. I called out her name, but there was no response. The only sound was faint laughter, echoing again through the empty hallway. The whispers made me freeze. I turned quickly, gripping the mop handle tightly, ready to defend myself. I moved slowly and cautiously. Something was happening here, something I couldn't explain. I headed up to the second floor, where I had heard the laughter earlier. When I reached the hallway, I noticed something strange. The wet footprints, the same ones I had seen earlier, had returned. I stared at the small, damp prints, which seemed to be heading toward me. I ducked into the nearest classroom, slamming the door shut behind me. I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath, my hands trembling. That's when I saw the blackboard. Scrawled in large, jagged letters were the words, "Hello." Had someone come in here? But I hadn't heard anyone enter. Suddenly, I heard the door rattling. Something was trying to get in. The handle twisted violently, shaking as though someone, or something, was pounding on it. I backed away, gripping the mop handle like a lifeline. The pounding on the door stopped. I slowly crept toward it and pressed my ear against it. But there was nothing. I reached for the doorknob, turning it as gently as possible. I cracked the door open slightly and peered into the hallway. I cautiously stepped out, scanning for any signs of movement. I had to find my coworker. I couldn't stay in this school alone any longer. As I walked down, from where I stood, I saw a shadow at the bottom of the stairs. It didn't move, just stood there, a dark figure faintly visible in the red light. As I got closer, I saw a young boy, maybe 13 or 14, standing with his back to me, wearing a tattered school uniform. I reached out, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Hey, are you okay?" The child didn't respond. I took another step forward, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch his shoulder. Then the child turned around, a horrifying mask, pale and soulless eyes, blood dripping from his nose, and a wide, toothy grin aimed at me. The child let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the stairwell, a shrill, piercing sound that felt like it was ripping through my skull. I staggered backward, dropping the mop. I ran as fast as I could down the hallway. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get out. The hallway seemed endlessly long in a horrifying way. I burst through the door into the gym. The gym was pitch black. I backed away from the door, my body trembling with fear. The footsteps stopped. The door remained shut. For a brief moment, I thought I was safe. But then, from the far corner of the gym, I heard it, a basketball bouncing. There, in the far corner, the child still stood, his face twisted into that eerie grin, holding a basketball and bouncing it slowly. Then the boy whispered, "Hello," his voice echoing through the empty gym. I stepped back, my legs trembling. The child took a step forward, then another. Each step was slow, deliberate, as though he was savoring the fear he was causing. I didn't think anymore. I bolted outside, running as fast as I could toward the parking lot. My legs felt like they would give out at any moment, but I kept running. I didn't stop until I reached my car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, finally unlocking the door and jumping inside. As I started the engine, I looked back at the school. In one of the second-floor windows, I saw the child standing there, staring down at me with that twisted smile. I hit the gas and sped out of the parking lot. The image of that child burned into my mind. I didn't return to the school the next night. I never went back there again. The mysterious harmony from the ancient piano. Ni, a young woman in her early 20s, stepped into a small, dimly lit antique shop in a quiet neighborhood. The shop was cluttered with antiques, old books, worn furniture, dusty frames, and a few musical instruments scattered around. The air reeked of aged wood and forgotten memories. Ni walked past the counter where the shopkeeper stood. He stared at her with wide, unblinking eyes, as if he had been waiting. His face was gaunt, his skin pale. He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was strange.
You found the piano. It's calling you. It will begin soon.
The word sent a chill down her spine since she hadn't mentioned the piano. The atmosphere grew odd. She decided to look around briefly and leave quickly. Then, Nee's gaze landed on a piano, old and tucked away in the corner of the shop. Despite its age, its darkened wood seemed to exude a mysterious allure. She brushed her fingers lightly over the keys. The instrument's delicate beauty starkly contrasted its eerie presence, making it irresistible. She approached the counter to face the man again. This time, she noticed his hands were marked with faint, dark scars, as if burned or clawed repeatedly, the lines deep and jagged. She decided to take the piano and leave. The door chimed behind her, and she turned to see the shopkeeper standing at the window, staring at her unblinkingly as she walked away. From the moment she placed it in her room, strange things began to happen. Nee began to play the piano softly, trying to familiarize herself with its peculiar presence. The keys, though old, worked, but felt strange beneath her fingers. Suddenly, Nee stopped playing. The music lingered in the air for a moment before dissolving into faint whispers. She stood, heart racing, unsure of what had just happened. One night, after a restless sleep, she returned to the piano. Nai found a yellowed sheet of music tucked among the piano strings. Curious yet uneasy, she played it, only to discover the notes resonated in an inexplicable way. It felt as though the notes were alive, playing themselves before her fingers touched the keys. Unintentionally, Nee had begun to unlock the tragic history of the piano's previous owner. She continued to play, unable to understand why she couldn't stop. She heard a faint voice whispering in her ear, speaking an ancient language. The words seemed to echo in her mind, filling her thoughts. She stood up abruptly, thinking she was probably too tired, and decided to head to her room and sleep. Nee drifted into slumber after a tense day. She was no longer in her room, but found herself in a grand concert hall. The room was empty, except for a grand piano at its center, and dim light from antique chandeliers that looked decades old. As Nee approached the piano, she saw a tall, gaunt man seated at the keys. He wore an old black suit, but his sunken eyes and pale skin made him look like a wax statue. Nee called out,
"Who's there?"
The man slowly turned around. His gaze pierced through Nee, and his voice echoed like a distant whisper.
I've waited a long time.
Nee tried to step back, but it felt like her feet were pinned to the floor. The man glided closer, not moving his legs, as if floating on air. Then the man pointed toward an old table nearby. On it lay a dusty sheet of music titled Sonata of Eternity.
There's not much time left. Only this melody can save us, or drown us both.
Before Nee could respond, the space around her twisted into a black vortex, engulfing her. She woke up with a start, drenched in sweat, clutching a corner of her blanket. Everything around her was silent. The dream not only left a haunting impression, but also led Nee to crucial details in reality. Perhaps she had unwittingly opened a door, allowing the spirits and tragic memories of the composer to resurface. She could still recall the image of the man struggling amidst the shadows, his eyes filled with despair, as if begging her to uncover the truth. She stopped playing the piano. For days, she couldn't bring herself to touch the instrument. Night after night, Nai heard whispers growing louder and more persistent, making everything feel increasingly unbearable.
Help me. Free me from the curse.
These words seemed to come from the trapped soul of the composer, still bound to the piano through his music. Waking in despair, Nee approached the piano, slowly sitting down. She noticed a small, faint mirror appearing behind the instrument. Nee cautiously wiped the dust from the mirror. Beneath the grime, the figure of a man slowly emerged. The gaunt man, his deep, dark eyes locked onto hers. He said nothing, but his gaze was intense, almost pleading, as if trying to convey something. After staring into the mirror, Nee saw words gradually appear on the glass. The crooked writing seemed as though someone was etching it from the other side. You have only one chance. Then his bony, emaciated hand reached out from the mirror, grasping toward her, begging for salvation. Understand the final rhythm before you play.
Please, help me. Save me.
A weight pressed against her chest before everything returned to normal. Nee realized she had to complete the sonata. The only way to break the curse was to finish the music she had started. She was plunged into despair and fear as she realized the price of freeing him. If she didn't play the final sonata, the curse would claim her as well. As Nee studied the sheet music, every note seemed distorted, warning her. It revealed the words, When the piano begins to play, you must finish the music before the light in the mirror fades. If not, the door will close forever. Nee swallowed hard, feeling the weight pressing down on her shoulders. Time was running out. It could happen at any moment. In her darkest hour, Nee sat before the piano, determined to break the curse. The clock struck midnight. The room was ice cold, and the music filled the air like an oppressive weight. Nee's fingers trembled as she began to play the sonata, the final piece in the composer's symphony of sorrow. But as she neared the final notes, Nee realized the sheet music was incomplete. A note had been erased, forcing her to rely on her intuition to finish the piece. She couldn't stop now. Then the mirror behind the piano shattered. Startled, she paused for half a second but couldn't stop. The gaunt figure of the man seemed to crack with the mirror, his eyes filled with despair.
Save me. Be careful. If you fail, you will take my place,
he cried out, his voice laced with agony. Nee played the final note, placing all her faith in her intuition. In the last moment of the sonata, the piano emitted a piercing sound. A brilliant light burst from the mirror, and she felt the entire room being drawn into the vortex. The man's figure vanished, and the room suddenly fell silent. In the ensuing silence, the figure in the mirror was gone, leaving behind a whispered,
"Thank you."
The room felt lighter, as if both their burdens had been lifted. When the light faded, Nee found herself sitting in her quiet room, all the strings of her instrument broken, and the mirror shattered. Exhausted, Nee collapsed on the piano. Perhaps everything was truly over, and fortunately, she had completed it. But deep down, Nee didn't know if she would ever truly escape the haunting melodies that had once drowned her.